fractions and focus a little bit more about division. When I look at a division mark, now remember, fractions make me sick, so especially when we look at divisions, it gets a little confusing. If I have a half divided by a half, the trick that I taught in an earlier video was that we use the cannon effect, and I put my cannon right here. I blow up the half, so that flips it over into a 2/1. My cannon backs up, blows again, flipping over the division into a multiplication, and then we bring down the half. This brings our math problem into a multiplication of fractions. And in an earlier video, we talked about the trick of a half of, my sloppy of, looks like a multiplication. A half of a dollar equals a quarter. And that reminds me that I multiply across the bottom and I multiply across the top. 2 times 2 is 4. 1 times 1 is 1. That reminds me that when I come down here, I multiply across the bottom to get my 2, and I multiply across the top to get my 2. And when I put that in the calculator and I read a fraction, because that's what I do, I read from top to bottom, I read the number 2, I divide. When I see this sign, I read the division mark, and then I read the bottom. So 2 divided by 2 equals 1. Well, that's a little counterintuitive in my mind. How can a half divided by a half equal a 1? So let me show you how I read that. So we're looking at this division that says a half divided by a half equals the number 1. And I'm going to translate this for you into the following. I'm going to say, how many of these guys go into these guys? How many of that, I'm going to call this a B, and I'm going to call this A. How many of B's goes into the A's? How many, in this case, halves go into a half? The way we're going to read that problem is how many halves go into a half? A half divided by a half. How many halves go into a half? So here's my half. This is what it's going to go into. And the question is, how many halves fit into that? So here's my piece of paper. How many halves do I have? Okay, well, this is 1/2. This would be another half. How many of these halves, a half divided by a half, how many of these halves fit into this? One half fits into that. And that's why we get the math problem. A half divided by a half equals the number 1. It takes 1 half to go into a half. So what if we have this math problem and I say a half divided by a quarter? Well, if we use the trick that I taught you earlier with the cannon, then I'm going to blow up the 1/4 and flip it over, so it's now going to be 4/1. This is going to ricochet back, and I'm going to blow up the division mark, so now that's a multiplication, and the half gets to come down. As we remember in the upper right hand corner, because I don't like fractions, I have to think of cookies and money. If I say a half of a half, and I write my of in a sloppy way that it looks like a multiplication, I know that a half of a $50 is a quarter. So now I remember to get the 4 with my trick here with the multiplication, I say 2 times 2 is 4, and 1 times 1 is 1. So to do this math problem, I remember that I need to multiply the bottoms, and that's how I'm going to get my 2. I multiply the tops, that's how I'm going to get my 4. When I read a fraction, I'm going to read it from the top down to the bottom, because that's how you read English. I'm going to read the 4, and then I'm going to read this line as the dividing sign, and I'm going to read 4 divided by 2. And the answer of 4 divided by 2 is 2. So this is counterintuitive to me. Half divided by a 4th is this big number 2? Well, it's a little bit easier if you read it using this little guide. How many of the second one, B, goes into the A's? How many of these go into that? So, how many of these goes into this? That's really the question that we're asking. So if we have a half, a piece of paper, how many quarters will fit into a half? So here's my piece of paper, and I need to make quarters because we're talking about how many quarters will fit. So this is a quarter. If I tear my paper and I have 4 pieces of quarters, the math problem is how many quarter pieces of paper will fit into a half a piece of paper. So if I fold my paper in half and I take my quarter pieces, I have 1 of them fits, and now I have 2 of them fit. And that's why I have the answer 2. It takes 2 quarter pieces of paper to fit into a half a sheet of paper. So let's up the ante and say a half divided by 1/3. We're going to be reading this as saying, how many of these fit into a half a sheet of paper? But let's do the math first and see what the math says with the cannon. So I put my cannon here. I blow up the 1/3. So now it's 3/1. It ricochets back. I blow up the division into a times. I bring my half down. I remember that a half of a sloppy half, a half of a $1/2 is a quarter. I multiply across the bottoms. I multiply across the top. So I come down here and I multiply across the bottom to get my 2, and then I multiply across the top to get my 3. How do I read this math? I read it from top to bottom. I read the 3, the division mark, and the 2. 3 divided by 2 equals 1.5. What is that answer telling me? That it's going to take 1.5 pieces of 1/3 sheets of paper to fit into a half a piece of paper. Okay, now we're really testing this concept, right? Oh my gosh. Yes, my brain hurts. So I'm going to turn this piece of paper into the half, and then I'm going to make a bunch of 1/3 pieces of paper, and I'm going to see if it takes me 1.5 pieces of 1/3 papers to fit into a half a sheet of paper. So here I go. This is my half piece of paper. And so this piece of paper, I'm dividing it into thirds. So here's my whole sheet of paper. Voila. Maybe not voila yet. Voila, almost. There, I've divided this piece of paper into thirds. So how many of these pieces of paper will fit into that? How many 1/3? This piece of paper is worth 1/3. How many 1/3 pieces of paper will fit into a half a piece of paper? Well, the answer says 1.5. Let's see. Let's prove ourselves right. So yes, one sheet of paper fits. Here's another 1/3 piece of paper. And if I look at this and I'm somewhat careful and I fold it in half, you will see that yes, if I fold a half of this, then 1/3 and a half of the 1/3 paper will fit into a half a piece of paper. I hope that helps.